Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a bit of a dreary day, but we need the rain, so we'll take it. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Paige Fortna. I'm the director of the Saltzman Institute, and it's a great pleasure to have with us today our distinguished guest, Jonathan Kirshner, for the 15th annual Kenneth and Waltz Lecture in International Relations. I'll say just a quick word about the lecture series, and then a quick word about our guest and our moderator, and we'll get going. So the Waltz Lecture was established by the Saltzman Institute in 2008 in celebration of a longtime Institute member, Ken Waltz, in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the field of international relations, which I probably don't have to convince any of you of. And as you'll see, also as a way to give leading scholars in the field an opportunity to engage with, debate, push back on, etc., Ken Waltz's work as we move forward with international relations theory. In the printed program, you can see a list of the previous speakers that have given the Waltz lecture, as well as Ken Waltz's full bio. So with that, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Jonathan Kirshner. Jonathan is a professor of political science and international studies at Boston College. Before starting at Boston College, he was the Stephen and Barbara Friedman Professor of International Political Economy at Cornell University, where he also was the director of Cornell's Reppy Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies from 2007 to 2015. Recipient of various distinguished awards from the Provost Office and teaching awards and things like that at Cornell. But the thing that he probably doesn't remember, but I remember about his time at Cornell, I don't know if you'll remember this, but I interviewed for a job at Cornell when I was actually not quite done with grad school, a bit early on the market, and I had a dinner with Jonathan and Peter Katzenstein. And Peter asked, he started off the dinner, like, I don't even think I'd gotten a fork full of food to my mouth yet. And he asked an incredibly erudite question. I do not remember the question. What I do remember was that the way he posed it used very large words, and the whole thing went right over my head. And Jonathan very kindly, being used to the way that Peter Katzenstein spoke, did this very gracious thing where you without seeming to, kind of stepped in and reframed the question in terms that I could understand so that I could answer it, and thus saved me. So other than saving ABDs on the market from great embarrassment, Jonathan is known for his research and teaching on international relations, political economy, macroeconomics, and film studies. He's author of many books, most recently An Unwritten Future, Realism and Uncertainty in World Politics, which came out with Princeton University Press in 2022. And this afternoon, he will be delivering a lecture titled Listening to Thucydides, Contingency, Chance, and Catastrophe in Contemporary World Politics. Nice alliteration there. And our moderator today will be Jack Snyder. Always pleased to be able to introduce my friend and colleague, Jack, who will be moderating the Q&A for us today. He also needs no introduction in this room, but he is the Robert and Renée Belfer Professor of International Relations here at Columbia. His research and teaching spans topics from human rights, international relations theories, nationalism, democratization, naming and shaming in the international system, et cetera, et cetera. Also the author of too many books to name in my introductory remarks, but the most recent one is Human Rights for Pragmatists, Social Power in Modern Times, also from Princeton University Press in 2022. Same year, same press. Good job. Before I hand it over to Jonathan for his remarks and to Jack to moderate, I also want to thank especially Ingrid Gersman and Olivia Grinberg, who maybe stepped out, and all of the Saltzman staff who so ably make it possible for these events to happen. So thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Olivia, wherever you are. And with that, I will turn it over to Jonathan. Thanks.
I've got my pages in order here. I actually don't remember that dinner specifically, but I remember many dinners like it.
You seem practiced at this.
Including my own. So it was quite an experience. But thank you so much for that most generous introduction. And I do want to begin by saying what a special pleasure it is for me to be here from the earliest days of my own professional life to the very present. I've always looked up to Columbia University's international relations programs as just one of the handful of the truly great higher programs in the world. And so I relish the opportunity to be with you here today. I also, it's important to me to note the absence of Bob Jervis. I was not his student, nor like so many of you here, a very close affiliate, but I did value enormously the time I had with him, and he was just a tremendous influence on so much of my work. And even now, to me, his absence is quite noticeable. So I just wanted to mention that. And it's also such a pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the room. I don't have the opportunity to mention them all, but I so appreciate that everybody is here. I like to begin all my talks with apologies. That really goes well for me. And today I have two apologies. One is, can't see it with the spectacular view, but I'm actually just a kid from Queens. And that means two things in the context of this talk. One is, I don't have any ancient Greek. So when I talk about Thucydides, I am relying tremendously on numerous translations, various commentaries, and the contributions of many classicists. It's kind of a secondary work in that regard. And secondly, also a function of being from Queens, I will likely mispronounce a ton of proper names, and I'm just going to ask you to forgive me for that. All right, so that's by way of apology and background, but let me get into the meat of my argument, which is I want to talk about Thucydides, and I want to talk about why I think he is still not well utilized by IR scholars. In particular, most IR scholars, and there are very important exceptions to this, some of them are in this room, but most IR scholars are what I call revolving door Thucydideans. In with the rise, out with Milos, right? In with, it was the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which with this inspired in Sparta that was the true underlying cause of the Peloponnesian War, and out with, and aligned in the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And what I want to talk about today essentially is that the way we understand both of those things is essentially wrong, or at least very much misunderstood. Crucial question to now ask. So what, right? I mean, so we get Thucydides, we're not using Thucydides well. The point I really want to make is, to borrow a literary phrase, the Peloponnesian War is a heartbreaking work of staggering genius. And that it offers us, students of international relations, timeless theoretical and practical insights, most of which to this day remain overlooked by most of us in the IR community. But as my teacher, Bob Gilpin, said, the history of Thucydides provides insights today as when it was written. Right? If Thucydides was placed in our midst, Gilpin continued, he would have little trouble in understanding the power struggle of our age. I think both of these things remain true and speak to why it's worth still taking Thucydides very, very seriously. So in the balance of the talk, I'm going to do kind of four things. One is that I want to revisit this revolving door, which I think is the problematic part of the way in which we often handle Thucydides. But some qualifications. Yes, Thucydides definitely held the rise-fear argument. And indeed, in so doing, he actually put a very valuable tool in our little IR toolkit that we use to understand how the world works. But as I'm going to elaborate, that was not his main point. And it was not remotely his motivation with the work. So I want to make that observation first. Then I want to step into the revolving door and stop it from spinning for a second and talk just about a handful of other vital lessons that I think are in the Peloponnesian War, but that we don't spend enough time talking about or thinking about or applying. And then I'll come out the other side of the revolving door and pop out of the Melian dialogue, and again, insist that generally, important exceptions, we misunderstand what the entire purpose of the Melian dialogue was, and that it's actually important that we understand what, indeed, it was. And just to give you a sense of the revolving door, I would just remind most of you that the rise argument takes place in year zero. what we call book one. Page 16 of a text in the one standard edition that runs 550 words. The Melian dialogue takes place in year 16. It closes what we call book 5. And again, I keep saying we call because Thucydides didn't write in books. He wrote in warfighting seasons and years. The books are a post-Thucydidean invention. And that when we read the Peloponnesian War as Thucydides intended, in that way, actually, it makes it easier for us to understand what the purpose of discussing the Melian dialogue was in the first place. Okay, so that's, and then in the final part of the talk, I will say, okay, well, what about today? I fear that much of the today stuff is going to be nudged into Q&A, but I do think there are some very important lessons for today that we can apply to current events in world politics, and I think there'll be a lot of interest for us in doing that. But let's go back to where I said we were going to start with the rise of Athens as the underlying cause of the initial war. Again, unambiguous in his view. And again, thanks Thucydides for giving us this tool in our kit. This is where the origins of what we would call today dynamic systemic theory, right? That changes to the international balance of power are an important cause of international instability in world politics. I mean, for many of us, certainly for someone like me, it's one of the most important tools in the IR toolkit. And again, I do think that Thucydides can stake a claim to be the one to articulate it first. However, 4 questions. Was this his main argument? Is this what mattered most to him? 2, can his systemic argument be considered profitably in isolation from another variable just as important to Thucydides, a non-systemic variable, what we would today call something like national character? 3, my personal favorite, was the start of the war, from Thucydides' perspective, a trap? And 4, was Thucydides even opposed to the initial war, and did he think it was bad for Athens? Spoiler alert, no, 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 and no. And now I'm going to spend some time elaborating my 4 no's to that question. So again, I'm being a little redundant here, but I don't want to be confusing. Thucydides clearly articulated the dynamic and believed it was the underlying cause of the first phase of the war. He states this plainly 3 times. We do want to note that the reason why he was pushing so hard on that is possibly because he was trying to counteract the conventional wisdom of the day, which blamed the war on Pericles. And Thucydides, in contemporary terms, was a major Pericles fanboy. And so in pitching this other explanation, maybe he was trying to, protect he who he revered so much. But more important, the start of the war is not Thucydides' principal focus. The war starts at the beginning of book 2, what we now call book 2. Of 8, it starts at 15% of the way into the narrative. Okay? So the overwhelming majority of the work takes place after the war's outbreak. To me, this suggests that Thucydides thought he had a lot more to say than here's what caused the war. And again, even when talking about the origins of the initial war, it is almost impossible to escape the importance of what we today call national character in explaining both the origins and the course of the war. In the first great debate in the Peloponnesian War, we have in the Spartan assembly speeches of the Corinthians, the Athenians, and the Spartans. And for each of these speeches, the difference in the characters of Athens and Sparta is a central theme of the talks. The Corinthians, who play a much larger role in this war than I think we often think they do, really harp on this idea of character and the difference between Athens and Sparta in pretty much complaining about Sparta's relative passivity at this moment. And then, forcefully, and this is important, in Thucydides' own voice, he appeals to the, quote, wide difference between the 2 characters in explaining how the events unfolded. Many classicists hold that the distinction between the Athenian and the Spartan characters are the overarching themes of actually the entire work itself. And we can see other examples of this littered throughout the study. Thucydides also attributes the example of the success of Syracuse, for example, in explaining the outcome of the war, saying that it was the Syracusans who, quote, were most like the Athenians in character. And that's why Thucydides thinks they did such a good job in taking on the Athenians late in the war. Okay, so that's one of my questions, which is, again, sure, rise of Athens, but also you gotta respect the argument about character in there as well, and that may matter. Second, again, one of my favorites, did Thucydides think this was a bad idea, this war? Let's remember, when we say the Peloponnesian War, we're really talking about three phases. An original 10 years of fighting, an uneasy 7-year interregnum, and then 10 years after that. Where does Thucydides stand on the initial outbreak of that first 10-year war? And then we go back to the idea that who's Thucydides' favorite person? Pericles. And Thucydides' praise of Pericles is very clear throughout the book. Most of the time, Thucydides speaks as an omniscient narrator. Every now and then, Thucydides speaks up in his own voice, but it's rare that he does. And so when he does, we kind of ought to take that a little more seriously, because he's kind of stepping out and saying, this isn't me, omniscient narrator, telling you what happened. This is me, Thucydides, telling you what I think. And what did Thucydides think about Pericles? He thought he was, quote, ablest alike in counsel and action among all the Athenians. And, quote, he was the best man for all the needs of the state. And Thucydides arguably says that it is the passing of Pericles from the scene that leads to Athens' ultimate defeat in the war. Thucydides also treats Pericles really well by, when Pericles speaks, Thucydides withholds other voices, what might have often been strongly dissenting voices. This is true especially with Pericles' initial call for war. As Thucydides says, there were many speakers who came forth to give support to one side or the other. But again, the only speech he gives, and this is not common, usually he gives two sides of an argument, is only the words of Pericles. And Pericles' rousing speech, as one prominent Thucydidean scholar wrote in the 1940s, says, could stand as a summary of Thucydides' thought throughout the whole first book. So I think this is very important, and again speaks to my third and favorite point, was this a trap? And the answer is no. I mean, bluntly, I think Graham Allison has this exactly wrong. In his book, Destined for War, Allison insists upon framing the Peloponnesian War as a tragedy that neither side wanted to fight. Allison speaks, quote, of their repeated attempts to avoid it, and, quote, their best efforts to prevent conflict. Allison says that Pericles did not want war, but ultimately, quote, bending to popular pressure, he reluctantly drew up plans for war. This is all exactly wrong. Pericles was a strong advocate for war, rejecting explicitly all calls for compromise and negotiated solutions. He rallied the public with a rousing speech. The central point was this, quote, it must be thoroughly understood that war is a necessity. And the public didn't sway Pericles. Pericles, after this debate, Thucydides reports the opposite happened. The public voted for war because they, quote, were persuaded of the wisdom of his advice. Now, the Spartans did the same thing. They did not search for a peaceful solution. In fact, they refused to submit the dispute that was the proximate cause of the war to arbitration, which would have been the thing they were supposed to do under the rules of the 30 Years' peace that was then in place. You have a problem, you submit to arbitration. They did not, and they came to regret doing so, and acknowledged explicitly that they were in the wrong and that they should have and could have actually gone to arbitration. This is years later where they're looking back with dismay on what had followed. So neither side is making their best efforts to avoid war. But Destined for War frames the Peloponnesian War with analogies to World War I and the Cuban Missile Crisis to warn that the US and China might somehow stumble into a war that neither side wants. And certainly it is true in the US-China case. You can imagine a kind of Guns of August scenario being all too plausible today. But the central analogy to the Peloponnesian War does not hold. Neither Athens nor Sparta were sleepwalkers. Both Athens and Sparta preferred war to peace. And part of this is a presentist fallacy. In ancient Greece, war was a common and routine way of solving problems. Today, and I'm glad we do, but we tend to approach war, even if we think it inevitable, with much more aversion and caution than they would have done back then. However, if we're going to bandy about a phrase about a trap, I do want to say that Thucydides was warning of a trap. There is a giant trap that he wants to alert us to in his book. It was one of the main purposes of his book. But it was not that changing power dynamics might cause actors to unwittingly sleepwalk into an unwanted war. Again, Thucydides was an enormous admirer of war advocate Pericles. He did not situate the tragedy in the outbreak of the initial 10-year war. The tragedy was not that the war took place. The tragedy for Thucydides was that Pericles' wise strategy was abandoned after Pericles left the scene. Athens did indeed fall victim to a terrible trap, and one with undiminished contemporary relevance. And that is the trap of hubris. Ultimately, in the phrase Thucydides uses over and over again, Athens grasped for more, and in grasping for more, ultimately caused its undoing. That is the great lesson of the Peloponnesian War. Actually, there are lots and lots and lots of lessons in the Peloponnesian War, and I could talk about those lessons a little too much. So I'm going to skip some of the lessons, but I want to acknowledge them and get to some of my favorite lessons because I think they're also important and applicable to contemporary politics before getting on to that story about the revolving door. Thucydides really does a great job showing us, IR scholars 2,500 years ago, how important the balance of power can be in explaining decisions that states make. And I have some nifty examples of those if you want to do them in Q&A. Thucydides also really thought that the quality of leadership mattered, which I think is making a lovely comeback in much IR theory, but it's still not a predominant view. But it was Thucydides' view. Leadership mattered enormously. Thucydides also spent a lot of time explaining why regime type mattered in explaining state behavior. And that's something we can also dive back into. But I want to look at two or three other lessons from the Peloponnesian War that I thought were more important to Thucydides that, again, I think are of just such tremendous pressing relevance today. One is Thucydides' emphasis on the central role of contingency and analytical uncertainty in explaining the course of international relations. And this concept of uncertainty is often misused in contemporary IR theory, and I hope we'll have a chance to jump back at that in Q&A. But for now, I just want to emphasize how Thucydides constantly showed how things need not have occurred as they did, that events were largely unpredictable, and that things like votes on the most momentous choices throughout the war were often very close, suggesting that the other outcome could have happened. And actually, sometimes votes were taken and then they were reversed, suggesting very much so that either outcome was possible. And really fascinating, I know many of you here study the military battles of the Peloponnesian War more closely than I do, but many of those military battles, and not small ones, but big and important ones, were determined not by the calculable correlation of the forces of the two sides, but by the unforeseeable interventions of chance and even blind luck. And this is a theme that Thucydides hammers home again and again. When Thucydides introduces the Spartan king Archidamus, he praises him, again, speaking in his own voice, in a rare personal comment. He calls him a wise and moderate man. This king advised against rushing into war with Athens because he said, quote, the course of war cannot be foreseen. So he said we have to just be a little more cautious because we don't know which way down the tree these events are going to take place. He didn't say the tree part. But again, this adage is illustrated again and again over the course of the Peloponnesian War, that the course of war cannot be foreseen. Another profound Thucydidean insight, and one that is invisible inside the revolving door, but to Thucydides was so important, is the fragility of civilization. the fragility of civilization. In my view, this, along with the mortal danger of hubris, are the two lessons that most plainly fulfill Thucydides' stated ambition to offer with his history, quote, a possession for all time. Thucydides' concern for fragility is illustrated again and again. One example that's very important is with the consequences of the plague ravaged upon Athens in the second year of the war. As Thucydides reports, with the tumults of the plague, men now just did what they pleased, coolly venturing on what they had formerly done only in a quarter. Similarly, during the Corsair Revolution, Thucydides notes how men, quote, took to butchering those of their fellow citizens who they regarded as their enemies, and that death raged in every shape. And as usually happens in such times, there was no length to which the violence did not go. As Thucydidean scholar Simon Hornblower argues, the importance of this section for the student of Thucydides' own opinions cannot be exaggerated. This also explains some anomalies in the text, like why Thucydides so often notes atrocities, even in settings of no strategic significance. One of my favorite, not a good word for this, is the rampage of the Thracians at Mycalus. Here and elsewhere, Thucydides slows the narrative down to observe the horrifying, savage, and indiscriminate and gratuitous violence that accompanies the crumbling of that thin layer of civilization. And he has a very long passage describing this that I won't share with you, but again, if you want to hear it later, I'd be happy to share it with you. And of course, most important to Thucydides, who admired in a vision of Athens that lived in his mind, the change in Athens of the war itself. Thucydides describes how late in the war, quote, the Athenian people grew uneasy and suspicious, convinced that an oligarchic conspiracy was afoot, and that in a state of agitation, increasingly mob rule prevailed. Suspects herded into prisons as, quote, public feeling grew daily more savage. One prisoner was induced to give information, but whether this coerced confession, Thucydides explains, was true or not, it is impossible to say. Nevertheless, on the basis of this coerced confession, the informer was released, and those he accused were brought to trial and tried in courts which, quote, executed as many as were apprehended, with little regard for whether they had been punished unjustly. And again, I think this is a very important part of the Thucydides story about the war and about Athens and about societies under stress, even long-standing democracies. Still later in the war, Athens becomes a very conspiratorial place, and conspiracies and conspirators are running rife throughout the city, and people became, quote, uncertain about each other, unwilling to speak his mind to his neighbor, to coordinate perhaps resistance against an emerging tyranny. Instead, quote, men approached each other with suspicion, each thinking his neighbor involved in what was going on. The conspirators having in their ranks persons whom no one could have ever believed capable of joining an oligarchy. Thus, after 100 years of democracy, Thucydides offers, it was no small matter to deprive the Athenian people of their freedom, but that's what happened. The assembly ratified the proposed constitution, and without a single opposing voice, it was then dissolved. But now we've come to what I think is the central point and lesson of the entire book, of the Peloponnesian War. If there is a Thucydides trap, although I would shy away from that phrasing, it is again the danger of hubris. Thucydides elaborates how, as Pericles had feared, that it was not the power and designs of adversaries that led to Athens' defeat and ruin, but rather hubris in the form of reckless overambition. Pericles died in the third year of the war, but before he died, he assured his fellow citizens of victory, quote, if you can consent to combine schemes of, if you can consent not, keyword, if you can consent not to combine schemes of fresh conquest with the conduct of the war, warning further, indeed, I am more afraid of our own blunders than the enemy's devices. What did Thucydides think about these observations? He said, the correctness of his foresight concerning the war became better known after his death. And indeed, Athens fell not because it was overtaken by its rivals, and Athens fell not because it was the victim of systemic forces beyond its control, but rather because it became intoxicated by the idea of its own greatness. And it could not recognize the limits of its own power. Again, we see the contrast with Pericles. Thucydides lauds Pericles, quote, for his ability to have rightly gauged the power of his country. And again, this comes to full flower with the disastrous decision to try and conquer Sicily, but Thucydides foreshadows this essential argument with events 10 years before the Sicilian campaign at the events of Pylos. A very important battle. Sparta suffers a disastrous setback at Pylos. And we have a twofer here, because the reason why Sparta lost at Pylos was due to an unpredictable stroke of luck. It was blind chance that was decisive in determining the outcome of this extremely large confrontation. And so Sparta says, all right, let's offer Athens terms. And so they say, look, we'll give you this, and this, you're doing well, we're doing poorly, but please recognize that the underlying balance of power hasn't really changed all that much. You guys got really lucky here. And so let's try and find an agreement that's going to acknowledge that we're giving you stuff, but we're still a pretty powerful state. Again, famously, even though Athens only had a temporary advantage due to this stroke of luck, Thucydides reports famously, the Athenians, however, grasped at something further and rejected the offer, though soon enough they began to repent rejecting the treaty. And this was a mistake they would make more than once. Thucydides reports several times how the Athenians, quote, kept grasping for more and then kind of regretting it later on. And this episode 10 years previously is the preview of the central episode of Thucydides' entire narrative, this disastrous decision to try and conquer Sicily. The entire Sicilian affair falls outside the revolving door, by the way, but it is the topic of books 6 and 7 of the Peloponnesian War, about 1/4 of the work. And Thucydides begins in what are some of the most closely argued passages in his opus. The Athenians were now bent on invading, being ambitious in real truth of conquering the whole. For Thucydides, Athens' undoing was its hubris over Sicily. That, more than anything, was the catastrophic blunder. It wasn't something that happened in year 0 or year 1 of the war. All right, now let's dive back into that revolving door, because suddenly we can understand Melos in a very different way. Why Melos? Why do we even talk about Melos? Was it important for the war? No, it was not, as countless scholars have observed. One expert, writing in 1907, finds the entire Melian passage extraordinary. Why? Quote, because the expedition to Melos was of no importance whatsoever. But it was obviously important to Thucydides, who stops his narrative in its tracks to dwell on this digression and, in fact, invent a new narrative form. The Melian dialogue is the only dialogue in the entire book. Any thoughtful reading of the Peloponnesian War must reckon with the question of why. Why Melos, a trivial backwater whose fate was of no military significance? We don't need Melos to dwell on the episode and to understand the perils of anarchy. Okay, by this point, we've got the perils of anarchy nailed. I mean, some quick examples. Early in the war, the Plataeans surrender to Sparta, and they make a long and convincing plea for mercy in the face of Spartan victory. What does Sparta do? They massacre the men, enslave the women, and reduce the city. Why? For no other reason than, quote, to please the Thebans, who were thought to be useful in the war. In an unrelated massacre not long after that, Thucydides describes a disaster so great that, quote, I have not set down the number of dead because the amount stated seems so out of proportion to the size of the city as to be incredible. Even more telling, just a few pages before we get the Melian dialogue, we have this one sentence. Athens succeeded in reducing Scion, put the adult males to death, and made slaves of the women and children. Oh, exactly the same resolution as in Milos, right? But that got one sentence as opposed to 5 pages of dialogue. A paragraph before the Melian dialogue, Thucydides describes Sparta's capture of Hysaea and their, quote, killing of all the freemen that fell into their hands. You know what else we don't need the Melian dialogue for? We don't need the Melian dialogue to tell us that the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. As one recent commentary said, that's the theme of the whole book. We've been told that over and over again from the start. And by the start, I mean like in book 1, when the Athenians, defending their behavior before the Spartan assembly, say plainly, it has always been the law that the weaker should be subject to the stronger. So we have to just pause and say, why Milos? And one thing we want to think about is, what is Thucydides' methodology in telling his story? And there we can reach for a number of scholars, but an interesting one is Hobbes, who was one of the first to translate the Peloponnesian War in English. And he wrote, although Thucydides never digresses to read a lecture, moral or political, upon his own text, nevertheless, the narration doth itself secretly instruct the reader and more effectively than can possibly be done by precept. So there is Thucydidean authorial choice here that is so decisive. Imagine this exercise. Imagine that every word Thucydides reported was precisely accurate, which it could not possibly have been. It's an unrealistic standard for any work of history, and certainly impossible for Thucydides, who explains that he was often adjudicating through multiple oral accounts of events he did not witness, and again by his own acknowledgement, says that at times he recounted versions of speeches as he thought they would likely have been given. But even if everything he said was exactly right, again, we still have this definitive consequence of editorial choice, even when dealing with a situation where every word is true. What to include, what to elide, what to dwell upon at length, what to summarize perfunctorily, what to juxtapose, what to hold apart. Implicit judgments about what quote unquote mattered. None of these are a function of the facts, and Thucydides was a master of using these techniques to call attention to what mattered to him. As one scholar observed, Thucydides brilliantly uses the technique of, quote, extreme narrative deceleration to dwell on moments that he wishes to invest with meaning. Okay, so now we can go back to the Melian dialogue and ask ourselves the Marvin Gaye question, right? What's going on? Why are we stopping the narrative and dwelling endlessly on the Melian dialogue? Not important to the war, important to Thucydides. In fact, classicists even argue about its relative veracity, right? It was held in private. Most of the things that Thucydides reported took place in public. The participants in the dialogue are not named. They're unnamed Athenian emissaries. But usually when Thucydides gives speeches, he tells you who gave the speeches, and unnamed Melians who were probably executed after the fact, right? So we have a private dialogue with unnamed participants, many of whom did not survive. As Jacqueline de Romilly says, the highly improbable structure of the entire episode suggests, quote, Thucydides' authorship and embellishment. Again, why? The massacre is neither novel in the narrative nor relevant for the war. Could it cover the Melian dialogue? Maybe should have covered the Melian dialogue in one sentence, like the massacre at Scion, which ended up exactly the same way a handful of pages earlier. Same outcome, same relevance for the war. All right, I'm getting there. Classicists argue there are 3 likely reasons why Thucydides was so fixated on the Melian dialogue. One had to do with something I raised earlier, which is how Athens itself had changed over the course of the war. So go back to year 5 of the war. Athens faces actually a real crisis. The betrayal and rebellion of Mytilene, a privileged and significant ally of Athens, who stabbed them in the back and went running to Sparta, trying to cut a deal with Sparta and switch sides in the war. This is no small thing. And again, this is a significant and privileged ally. So Thucydides reports, and you can understand this, in the fury of the moment, the citizens of Athens voted to put to death, quote, the whole adult male population of Mytilene and make slaves of the women and children. That phrasing should sound familiar. Right? However, after reaching that decision and waking up the next day, the Athenians had something of a change of heart. And after the second day, they had a second debate in which that decision was narrowly overturned. Now, Thucydides makes very clear that he favored the second course of action over the first, but that second course of action was pretty punitive, but it wasn't, the full Melos. It was more nuanced, a more nuanced and punitive response. And again, the contrast with Melos a dozen years later is just so dramatic, right? From Athens' perspective, the earlier Mytilene action was this real betrayal and consequential, treacherous, dangerous, and potentially precedent-setting and consequential for the war. In contrast, as the scholar Donald Kagan observes regarding Melos, there was no immediate grievance that could possibly explain Athenian behavior. Yet over Mytilene, the Athenians were deliberative, and over Melos, they were barbaric. Right? And again, in Thucydides' own assessments of these things. And so the difference, I think, so one thing classicists say is what we're showing here is how Athens has changed over the course of the war, and so that's why Melos. A second one has to do with the fate of Athens itself. Hunter Rawlings' contribution to Thucydidean studies is to note the parallels between the first half of the book and the second half of the book, and he thinks that Thucydides was crafting the book to have all these parallels throughout in different parts of the book. And he sees in the Melian dialogue a mirroring in the deliberations over Athens' fate after they finally lost the war. Because all of Sparta's allies insisted that Sparta kind of go Melos on the Athenians and just wipe them out. And Sparta chooses not to do this, but Xenophon reports that near the end of the war, the Athenians actually were sitting around thinking a lot about what had happened at Melos and really worried about what was going to happen next. As another specialist put it, reading the Melian dialogue, no man who lived through the last years of the war could fail to see an allusion to the events of 404. That's when Athens is defeated and the debate is active. Should we just go on and full-blown massacre the Athenians themselves? But most important, or at least most important to me, I think the Melian dialogue is there to serve what I think is Thucydides' key purpose with the entire volume. His number one lesson, the lesson of hubris. Again, Thucydides wanted to write, quote, for all time, but he was always also writing for an initial audience that knew the course of the war and knew especially Athens' catastrophic decision to invade Sicily right after Melos. And now we have some insights into why Thucydides might have engaged in this extreme narrative deceleration at Melos, linking again his central lesson, hubris and Sicily. Remember again what I said about the Thucydides in the books. No books in Thucydides, it's by year and by season. And those things happened in the same year and the same season. And so with one final sentence, Thucydides describes the annihilation of Melos. Next sentence written by Thucydides, no break. That same winter, the Athenians resolved to sail again to Sicily, if possible, to conquer the island. So he's linking these events together in an important narrative way to make his point about hubris. And again, as still another scholar observed, it is particularly important to keep in mind that the Melian dialogue was written by an author and for a public who could read it as a prelude to the Sicilian expedition and indirectly to the final catastrophe. The Athenians, bullying and arrogant, were boundly self-confident, lacking humility even toward the gods. And yet this all comes back to haunt the Athenians very quickly in the Sicilian campaign. And in the midst of a blood-soaked, shattering retreat at the end of the Sicilian campaign, the Athenians increasingly come to sound like the Melians in the Melian dialogue, even appealing to the gods for salvation after they had kind of mocked the Melians for appealing to the gods for salvation during the dialogue. In fact, the entire Melian dialogue, almost line by line, can only be properly understood in that context. Athens' arrogance and hubris turned one-time allies into unhappy, hostile vassals that contributed to their loss in the war, just as the Melians predicted. Additionally, at crucial junctures, culminating in Sicily, from a position of relative strength and security, Athens foolishly and voluntarily embarked upon adventures that led to its own destruction. This is Thucydides' singular warning that the gravest threat to the security and integrity of the civilization of a great power lies not with the designs of its adversaries, nor from the tragic, uncontrollable implications of anarchy, but from the arrogance of power that is often associated with a predominant power. Now, I don't think I have much time left. Tell me, give me a minute, give me a number of minutes, Jack. Give me some, how many are there? From 0 to 5. 4. 4 minutes. I do want to then now just gesture at what I think are some of the most important applications of Thucydides as we look out these windows today and say that these insights are as fresh now as they were when he wrote. First of all, can we look out the window and see ambition and acts of horrifying barbarism? Is that part of the stuffing of world politics? I think unfortunately, yes, we can, and we really need to recognize that Thucydides was right to be alert to these things. But I think more important for us are two other things. One is that Thucydides, I haven't shared this with you yet, was quite anxious about demagogues and the susceptibility of democratic polities to demagogues. During the Corsairian Revolution, for example, he wrote, "Reckless audacity came to be understood as the courage of a loyal supporter. Prudent hesitation as specious cowardice. Moderation was held to be a cloak for unmanliness," interesting word. "Ability to see all sides of a question interpreted as the incapacity to act on any." Here's the takeaway line. In such settings, quote, "the blunter wits were most successful." And on that thin layer of civilization, again, to go back to Bob Gilpin. Bob Gilpin was very, very, very cautious. He was kind of a shy guy and did not tend to dive into debates about public policy, but he was absolutely apoplectic about the American decision to invade Iraq. He wrote, "This costly and reckless war," he wrote this in 2005, "represented a grave threat to the security and well-being of the United States, and one that, quote, significantly exacerbated dangerous social, cultural, and regional fissures in the US society." He attributed this catastrophic decision to hubris, ambition, and incompetence. So again, you don't have to look far to see fundamental Thucydidean lessons about the thin layer of civilization that we all enjoy and the consequences of hubristic arrogance abroad are shaping the world that we currently still live in. Finally, and just very quickly, two more lessons that I think are very important today. Thucydides' emphasis on uncertainty. This is something I want to talk about a lot because contemporary IR theory tends to imagine uncertainty as we don't know what's going to happen next. That's not what Thucydides meant. Contemporary IR theory, when they use the word uncertainty, what they really mean is risk. That we understand the underlying actuarial probabilities of what's going to happen next. We can't predict the outcome of the roll of 2 dice, but we know the underlying probability of every possible outcome. Whereas Thucydidean uncertainty, and this is a much more important concept, is living in a world in which you do not have access to the underlying probability distribution of the range of outcomes that might follow one choice or another. That is living in a fundamentally different world. And if we as IR scholars embrace a Thucydidean, or dare I say it, a Keynesian understanding of the concept of uncertainty, we would tailor our theories slightly differently than if we thought we were living in a world of actuarial risk. And finally, closing where I started, the danger of hubris remains extremely important. So that if indeed the US and China do come into armed conflict between them, I do think that the Thucydidean lesson would be that it was not a trap they fell into due to systemic forces beyond their control, but rather the clash of two hubristic great powers who were undone by various versions of their own arrogance. And so on that, if I'm in 4 minutes, I will stop.
Wow, Jonathan, that was really quite something. You completely outdone yourself. I've had 3 gigs in recent times with Jonathan, including this one as round 3. The first 2 were about his terrific book, An Unwritten Future. One of them was a Zoom with colleagues in Beijing. I don't know whether the subtext there was like to fend off the Third World War by reminding everyone of the dangers of hubris, but that was an excellent session where we talked about uncertainty and rationality and contingency and unpredictability. This makes me the second round was a forum of several book reviews by Barry Posen, Stacy Goddard on the Robert Jervis International Security Studies Forum. Very high quality discussion of the book. Read the book first, but then afterwards read the forum, which was very good too. Since it was the Robert Jervis forum, one thinks about how in Bob's books he recommended dealing with the problem of unpredictability and deep uncertainty about the future. His psychology book, a key punchline was, "You're probably wrong, so keep an open mind." In his systems effects book, one of the key punchlines was, whatever you do, part of it might point you in the direction that you were hoping to go, but partly the effects of your action are almost certainly going to come back around and bite you in a way that you hadn't anticipated, and you need to be prepared to go towards your goal, but also fend off the unintended consequences at the same time. So that's one of the things that we can talk about today is, how do you actually act to solve these problems of uncertainty? But the question that I want to ask you is hubris and the misunderstanding of the history of the Peloponnesian War by international relations scholars. So I remember very long ago, actually, I think it was while I was studying for my comprehensive exams, that I read some of the secondary literature on Thucydides. I remember an article by Daniel Garst in maybe International Studies Quarterly, where Garst says you know, that it's wrong of the structural realists to imperialize Thucydides as if it's something about power transition and the balance of power. It's about dialogues. The whole book is nothing but dialogues. And one of the key themes of all those dialogues is the hubris of Athens and of other actors in the story that lead to this tragedy. So I forget exactly when Ned Lebeau wrote his great book that interpreted Thucydides through this kind of prism of culture and character rather than structural realism, but it was a little bit after Dan Garst. So, you know, one question in this vein is, wait a second, we had the right answer at a certain time, and why did we like fall back to the Allison Thucydides trap, conventional wisdom, which is not just Allison, but it's, you know, how the field talks about it. To put a little twist on this, though, who were the scholars that within, you know, the IR mainstream today who are warning about the hubris of American imperial democracy? Well, John Mearsheimer just wrote his stunning book on the delusions of liberal imperial expansion, and Bob Gilpin, the quote that you just read. So this is not only or even mainly a problem of realist scholars misunderstanding Thucydides and not understanding that the hubris of a great power is what's getting us in trouble. You know, a related question is, do social science tools leave us ill-equipped to understand a phenomenon such as hubris? So not long ago, there was an article in International Security, our major journal in this field. I think it was Dominic Tierney's, where one of the things he talks about is the psychological bias of overconfidence. Mm-hmm. And overconfidence is something that Bob Jervis talked about. There's a body of actual psychological findings that shows that people in general are often overconfident. But so how do you think about that type of literature, which people in this room know about? We teach it in our IR theory classes. Are we missing the boat with that kind of watered down, kind of thin gruel that doesn't capture the emotional or depth psychological oomph of hubris, if we just treat it as a kind of cognitive heuristic bias? And also, just to ask you to define hubris, because you talked about being consumed with one's own greatness, grasping for more, and also just making tactical mistakes, because at Syracuse you thought that it would be an easy win. Are all these the same thing? And what's the core idea of hubris? What's the impelling force at base? So
all right, I'll see what I can do with that. Characteristically outstanding queries. I think I have 4 or 5 things to say in response that I think are productive. The most important is, I do want to acknowledge that others have made the argument that Thucydides is misunderstood by most, but not all, by our scholars. And there's been very good work on this in the past. You mentioned the Garst piece, which many of us have read. I think there's another piece, I hope I'm getting the name right, by David Welsh, who also wrote just a terrific paper, because there is a difference between, I mean, when you go in and read the Thucydides in a serious way, if you're like me, you kind of scratch your head and say, this isn't really how Thucydides was presented to me, and so you note that, and then you want to talk about it. And so these guys have done that, others have done that. Certainly Lebeau took his crack at it. And so this is basically my crack at that, having been so intellectually stimulated by needing to read Thucydides carefully to work on the realism volume. So I do want to be very plain that these are points that in different versions and guises and varieties of emphasis, good scholars have made. But as you note properly, but it hasn't caught on, I don't think. I've had what I thought were some great teachers in IR, both in undergraduate and graduate. And when they trotted out Thucydides, it was the revolving door, right? It was, what do we know from Thucydides? Well, it was that, you know, the rise of Athens and the fear of Sparta, and that's why we had the Peloponnesian War. And then the other is, and look, Thucydides shows us that you can make all these moral arguments, but all your morality isn't going to do it very good if someone's going to come and massacre you. And so I do think that neither of those were what Thucydides was trying to tell us, and that he had a lot to say, and I was excited enough about that to try and, you know, join those chorus of scholars who are making arguments like that. Certainly, I don't want to suggest that those important contributions hadn't been made as well. So all I can do is give a hat tip in that direction. But to the more pointed part of your question, IR scholars like things simple. And so if we can kind of be handed something that's very, very simple, and then we think we can use it, then we like that. And Thucydides did give us some, I mean, the importance of the changes in the balance of power to international stability is important, and it's a great tool, and I wouldn't get up in the morning without it. I just think that he had so much more to offer us than that, especially in the times we're living in. When you read his passage about civilization and the erosion of democracy and the fragility of order and uncertainty and demagogues, and the passages written so beautifully in translation, obviously, about the ways in which polities can be overcome by these hysterical movements. Read today, they're frightening. And because they seem so alive and present with things that we may be experiencing. So, but I don't have a quick and easy answer as to why these observations were made before, but the discipline as a whole hasn't picked up on it. I want to say very briefly, without dwelling on it, because I think it will sidetrack us a bit, that I find much of John Mearsheimer's contemporary analysis of world politics puzzling, because most of the actors are behaving in ways that his most prominent theory, the theory of offensive realism, says they should and must do and will do deterministically. And yet he observes those things, and now he's kind of complaining about them. And so I've often found a disconnect between the important theoretical contributions Mearsheimer made to IR theory over the decades to his current public persona of, you know, virulent critic of American foreign policy. I think there's a disconnect there. So I just want to acknowledge that and move on without getting into a big to-do about all that. The other two questions you raised, I think, are more directly on what I was trying to argue. They have to do with social science tools. You went in the direction of psychology. Which is, you know, and obviously, you know, Bob made enormously important contributions there. And as I've said, you know, is I think one of the most influential and important IR thinkers of our time, and, you know, value all of that so much. It's not naturally where my own analytical instincts go. But so when I think about the phrase you use, where social science tools, I go back with Thucydides to Keynes, Knight, and Hayek, to economists. And with another hat on, I'm really steeped in the original writings of John Maynard Keynes. When most people think about Keynes, they think of the practice of post-war Keynesianism, which is a very different thing than the economics of Keynes itself. Keynes himself thought that the Keynesian revolution was founded on two pillars. And I'm only going to talk about one pillar because this is an IR seminar. But that one pillar was uncertainty. And again, the distinction between risk and uncertainty. And this was a concept that was articulated quite fully by a virulent anti-Keynesian called Frank Knight in his book, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. And Knight emphasized the essential unknowability of things, the essential unpredictability of things. He liked this. He thought it was the engine of capitalism. One of the reasons why he hated planning so much was because he thought the whole thing operated on the fact that people looked at the same set of ideas and information and came up with disparate responses to it. And that's where entrepreneurship comes from, and that was the magic of capitalism. Similarly, Keynes criticized conventional economic orthodoxy for having assumptions about how people process information that are different than the ones we actually have. He said that we live in a world of uncertainty and not on risk. What does that mean? Simply put, it means we don't have access to the underlying proper model of how the world works. And this gets into some controversial territory because many of our rationalist theories of war borrow an assumption from an economic theory called rational expectations theory, which says that rationality means two actors looking at exactly the same information must reach the same conclusion. But that depends upon something. And what that depends upon is that they're filtering that information through the same analytical model, either implicitly or explicitly. And in rational expectations theory in economics, the assumption was that actors had converged around that singular correct model. As the rational expectations theorist Thomas Sargent once said, you cannot talk about multiple models in rational expectations theory. God, the econometrician, and all actors in the economy share the same model. Right? And that's why, when presented with the same information, they reach the same conclusions. But if there are people can walk around with multiple models in their head of how the world or how the economy or how war or how politics might work, then people can look at exactly the same information and reach divergent conclusions about the consequence of this on that. It is very subversive of that view. Now, in my own view, first of all, we can look at the empirical testing of rational expectations theory and end this debate very quickly. But in my own view, history shows that informed experts looking at the same information actually walk around with divergent implicit models of how the world works in their heads. Long trip to the store, but when you use the phrase social science tools, what Keynes was urging upon his intellectual descendants was to try and embrace a model of social science that understood we lived in a world of analytical uncertainty, not calculable risk. And that doesn't mean you just throw up your hands and say, well, the world's unpredictable, so I'm giving up. Right? Keynes built economic models, Hayek built economic models, Knight built economic models. They all were still in the business of trying to describe, explain, understand, anticipate how the economy would work. But in every case, they said, but it is a world of analytical uncertainty, and we must temper our understandings of what we think will happen next with the knowledge that it's a world of uncertainty and not a world of risk. Now, psychology, again, which is not the direction I bend into in that way, is another way of saying behaviors are going to be disparate, not uniform. And so you need to tailor your expectations and understandings of how the world works and how actors will act by bringing in variables like that. But it also does speak to this question as a scholar of hubris. As a scholar, it means how much can we know? And the reason why it's important is because a sensitivity to the limits of our own knowledge may temper our own analytical overconfidence in expecting one thing to happen rather than another. And so at a scholarly level, that's hubris. But to get back to your real question about hubris, I think it is rooted for, putting my classical realist hat back on, in the notion of respect for power. What do I mean by respect for power? I mean respect for the fact that your own power has limits. And for the United States, we've seen a lot of illustrations of that in the past 20 years, right? We have this monumental amount of military capability, but can we use that military capability to impose our political will on others? Well, that hasn't turned out quite as well as just measuring the military capability might have happened. The flip side of that is respect, which is not to say we like it, but an awareness of the power of others, right? So we have power, but others have power capabilities too, and we need, in thinking of how we might want to exercise our power, to understand that there are other centers of power out there that might resist the exercise of our power, and what that means. And so respect for the limits of our own power, respect, value neutral sort of a way, for the power of others is an important part of the hubris story. I want to square this circle by getting back to Bob Gilpin and his critique of the Iraq War. Again, the Iraq War and the Vietnam War, I think, were similar in that they were both rooted in the imagination that American power was just so awesome it could not be stopped from doing what it's doing. And in that sense, I think Bob Gilpin has the Vietnam War wrong. Because I think Bob Gilpin nested the American experience in Vietnam War in his overall argument in War and Change World Politics about America reaching the frontiers of its own power, and that then costs are greater than benefits, and they're not actually, able to sustain the breadth of their hegemonic control. Whereas I think, with Thucydides, with Raymond Aron, that it was more this exercise of hubris. It's like, we cannot imagine a world in which we, the United States, so powerful, so capacious, so advanced, so smart, cannot simply impose our will on this tiny, obscure nation, Vietnam. It just did not compute with them, and that is so both in Vietnam and Iraq, that's the hubris, I think, that we're talking about here, the inability to conceptualize the limits of one's own power.
Okay, thank you. The floor is open. David?
We have a microphone here, we're recording, so.
May I also ask that the speakers speak into the mic a little bit more, Rex in the back?
Jonathan, I really enjoyed your talk, and I admire just about everything you do. I want to offer this as a friendly amendment. I think that if there's a way to structure your interpretation so that it's not just a matter of saying, I'm reading this and I interpret it better than the next guy, which is to look at Thucydides' teachers. Who was his main teacher was Hippocrates. So maybe his motive for this was presenting hubris as a disease that would be recognizable by future generations, right? And he does it given the structure that he knew, the only narrative structure that he knew, which was the Greek tragedy. And the Greek tragedy, the denouement between the denouement is the rapid dialogue between the Greek chorus and the tragic hero, which is called the stichomuthia. And the Melian dialogue is the stichomuthia. So it's kind of the high point of this Greek tragedy, which makes a lot of sense. Why it kind of peters out afterwards, I would honestly say, there's some people who say he rewrote the first scrolls. He did a first draft. He went back to the beginning. The first scrolls are a second draft. It's much more carefully written, and he died before he got to the last couple scrolls. So, but I think that kind of actually helps your interpretation even more.
That's great stuff. I mean, and again, I got to go kid from Queens on you on this one. You're just talking way over my pay grade. I think that those are really sharp observations, and I like the reaching for the medical analogy. I think that Thucydides and many thinkers in that vein over the millennia have often reached for medical analogies in trying to understand politics and international politics in general, and I find that appealing, it's not medicine, but one of my go-to lines is George F. Kennan, his admonishment to IR scholars that we should be gardeners and not mechanics in our understanding of how international politics works. And so again, I think those biological metaphors are important. I think they're important for Thucydides as well. I can't speak to the Hippocrates part, but actually, for me, if I was going to say this is it's not a dialogue, it's an exchange of speeches that captures the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War. It's the debate between Nicias and Alcibiades right before the Sicilian expedition, in which Nicias pours his heart out, explaining why this is such a terrible, terrible idea, and articulating almost all of these Periclean lessons. Why do you go out to find enemies here when you already have enough enemies at home, and all of these things. And it seems obvious that he is speaking with Thucydides' voice as well. And then Alcibiades basically says, we're unstoppable, we must go forever, we must do this now. It's that, I think, whatever language you would use to describe the two sides of that type of dialogue, that I see as, if I could only pull out one exchange of thoughts in the entire book, it would be that debate.
Dick.
This all brings me back to the only thing I ever wrote at length about Thucydides, and that was a course paper for Bob Jervis when I was in graduate school. And it was, I guess, a pedestrian and at least then common sort of exploration of the analogies between the Peloponnesian War and the Cold War. And I don't remember ever thinking consciously much about hubris, except maybe in likening the Sicilian expedition to Vietnam or whatever. But I don't remember a lot of Thucydides. I don't read the book every year. But I'd ask you, was he not complicit in the hubris himself? And that is, you note he supported the war, he admired Pericles, and at least what I remember about Pericles is the funeral oration, where he brags about how wonderful and superior Athenian civilization is, and how it should be a model to all the other inferiors in Greece. So is he sort of thinking of hubris as a tragic condition afflicting everyone, or am I missing the point?
So that's, again, just great stuff. And, we all should read Thucydides once a year because it's so rich, and you can go back to it time and time again and see different things in it. Again, I want to speak with caution in saying overly confident things about Thucydides because, I have relied so much on the generosity of classicists who have tutored me and invited me to their seminars and let me listen to them talk. But it's, careers have been spent studying this one book. So, what I'm trying to do is just sort of bring some Thucydides wares to our IR community in that limited way. And I think that you're right to observe that Pericles was a warmonger. He definitely could have avoided that first war. And I also don't want to come across as being a Thucydides worshiper. I mean, I find Thucydides' analysis and insights into IR and insights into human behavior brilliant, and I feel like I've learned a ton from them. But I don't know this guy. I mean, was he a good person? I have no idea. Did he have lots of blind spots? Definitely, right? You look at the book and you can see he underplays economic variables. Women are absent, and there are lots of things. Every author will inevitably have a lens through which they view the world, and he viewed it through his. We seem to understand he was kind of a wealthy fellow. He was also an Athenian general. I mean, that situates him in a very small subcategory of humans who saw the world in a certain way with all the biases that would have and all the meanings that would have. But the one thing I would say is that Pericles' initial war strategy, which was contested at the time, and sort of weird because it was not very quote unquote Athenian. It was a cautious and defensive strategy, and the Athenians were kind of go-getters and everything. Was clever and probably would have worked. And so and the first part of the war went, except for the plague, which was a real setback, but who could predict a plague? If I think Thucydides is on pretty solid ground saying things went really well for that war. If it was wise or not, I don't know, under Periclean leadership and following Periclean strategy. And then when Pericles leaves the scene, first you have a bunch of people who are less distinguished than he, and Thucydides suggests who are putting their personal interests above the interests of Athens itself, which he argues convincingly to this non-specialist reader, Pericles did not do. And in so doing, fell victim to a number of charismatic demagogic leaders who wanted to rally the people to advance a much more ambitious version of what the Athenian Empire would look like. But I think your instinctive critiques are fair. I mean, Athens is a big empire and getting bigger. Right, so where do you draw the line between Athens is a big empire and getting bigger, and Athens is undone by its own hubris? Was the hubris kind of baked in to what it was doing? And Pericles sort of gestures at this even in his original war speech when he says, look, guys, you've got an empire on your hands. Or maybe it was a mistake to accumulate it, but accumulated you have, and this war is presented to us, and if we want to hang on to our empire, we have to fight this war. And so parsing out where, being a responsible great power ends and being, a hubristic overexpander begins, I think you wrote a book about that. so there's, I don't have a short answer to that question, but again, I think in my enthusiasm, you can see why I find the text so fascinating for even just engaging these questions.
Yeah. Great talk, and very, very enjoyable as well. So early on especially, you talked a lot about the importance of character. But I didn't get a really good sense of what character is. Now, when you talked about the the Sicilian expedition, and you referred to Syracuse, and you said, Thucydides said that they were most like Athens in character. Now, they were a democracy. Is that the main theme here? Is this an argument about regime type? I think you're saying more than that. But so, just maybe say a little bit more about character and what Thucydides meant. Are there multiple dimensions, or is there a core in there?
Sure, another great question. I do want to pause and just underscore something we haven't talked about and need not talk about, which is, again, we remember Thucydides for making a dynamic systemic argument, but he was heavily into regime type. He thought if you want to understand how a polity is going to behave, you have to understand their system of governance. And it's going to affect how they act, and it's going to affect their decisions about the alliances that they choose to make. And so once you're getting into the pattern of choosing alliances and you're reaching for a subsystemic variable, you're in a somewhat different world than the caricature of Thucydides that we're often given. So that's kind of a sidebar preamble. To answer your question, this national character issue is not simply about democracy, although I can imagine that there may be an association with democracy and the type of character that Thucydides was talking about. I want to be cautious here because I haven't given this tremendous amount of thought, but what is clear is that the theme of the Athenians were like this, and the Spartans were like that. And that this war was a war between a polity that acted like this and a polity that acted like that is a theme that winds its way throughout the entire Peloponnesian War. And by character, the most simplistic way of putting it is that Athens was energetic. And I mean, somewhere before hubris comes ambition. They were ambitious, they were planning, they were, building, doing, like eager beavers trying to do more and interesting stuff. And they were also in so doing arrogant and annoying. And at the start of the war, Thucydides writes that men's feelings inclined towards Sparta, basically because Athens had gotten just so annoying in its behavior, turning essentially an alliance into an empire. But this general theme that what we're witnessing is a conflict in style and not just a clash of power comes up over and over and over and over again throughout the text. And really, the people who push this more than anyone are the Corinthians, who I think caused this war. But what happens is, there's a proximate cause of the war, a conflict between Corcyra and Corinth. Athens backs up Corcyra. Corinth is furious about this. Corinth is a Spartan ally, and they basically go marching to Sparta, and they say, you mothers, you guys are sitting here passively because that's what you do. You sit passively and you're stoic and you never do anything. Whereas Athens is wandering around the region, eating everybody's lunch because they're dynamic. And your stoicism and their dynamism is ruining our lives. And if you don't get off your butts and do something about this, we're out. We're just going to find other allies. And so that's a nice balance of power story, because one of the key reasons that motivates Sparta to action in the first place is Corinth is such an important ally that if they did pull out of the alliance, that was just too high a price for Sparta to deal with, and it's an important element in that initial debate. But it is this, what I guess we might call, entrepreneurship, ingenuity, go-getterism of Athens versus the cautious passivity of Sparta. And it comes up several times in the narrative and some of the battles in which Sparta gains an advantage that it doesn't aggressively press, because their instincts are always to be a little more on the cautious side. And then again with Syracuse, Thucydides describes Syracuse as a city in character like that was similar to Athens. And Thucydides says plainly, they were a tougher adversary for Athens than Sparta, because they shared these attributes that Athens shared, and it was a tougher clash for them than dealing with, kind of lumbering, cautious Sparta, who Athens found almost a more convenient type of power to go to war with. This is not something that I have focused on in my own work, but there's a very, very large strand of the literature of Thucydides that sees the entire war as a story in the study of national character, and that the conflict, its origins, course, and outcome, as attributable to those differences in the characters of the combatants. So that's what I mean by character. So it's not narrowly reducible to regime type, but you can't help but thinking maybe there's some affinity between democracy and this type of national character that Thucydides is describing.
I can't resist throwing in my own 2 cents on this, since I actually just read the part of Thucydides that talks about this first great debate stimulated by the Corinthians. And you're absolutely right. The whole discussion proceeds about, the alleged difference in national character between the Spartans and the Athenians, described exactly as you did. But they're, reaching into my social science toolkit, there is an underlying structural explanation in the literature on why Sparta was stodgy and slow to mobilize its troops and go attack Athens in this situation. And it's that, first of all, Sparta didn't have or need a far-flung empire. It had agricultural land that could provide what it needed, right in its own backyard. And it had a large body of helot slaves to do that work. And because the slaves were so numerous, they had to keep their army at home to make sure that there wouldn't be a slave revolt while the army was off, killing Athenians. Whereas Athens was exactly the reverse. That Athens had very little arable land. Athens was a trading empire. And on top of it, Athens was a democracy where the rowers in the navy, got not only their pay, but got to pillage the more they took over places like Milos. And so there's a straightforward political economy explanation underlying, what seems like a national character discussion in this debate and actually throughout the book.
No, I think that's exactly right, and so I don't want to be misunderstood, I try to emphasize this, but it need be said. It's not that Thucydides doesn't think, what we call kind of level 3 variables matter a lot. I mean, he does. They're peppered throughout the book. I mean, and everything you said about, Sparta, especially their anxiety about a slave revolt, tempered their willingness to take risks abroad. Also, again, just straightforward balance of power stuff. A key reason they agreed to the Peace of Nicaeus in year 10 of the war is because they had an expiring treaty with Argos, who they were very anxious about. So again, why the Peace of Nicaeus? Because because the Sparta is looking around at the balance of power, and that is an important part of it. And all of this stuff, my only insistence is that Thucydides is ranging gracefully, brilliantly, and importantly across all of our levels of analysis, but he's often presented to us as a kind of simple third level analyst. And the last one I'll give is, because it's a hat tip to Bob Jervis, is, obviously Thucydides had read Bob, because in this original confrontation between Corinth and Corcyra wants Athens to ally with them. The reason why Athens comes to Corcyra's defense is a balance of power reason. Corcyra's navy was too important for Athens to allow to fall into enemy hands. But they only agreed to a defensive alliance because they thought it would be less provocative, and they were still trying at that moment to avoid the conflict with Sparta. So all of these moving parts are going on, but that's all I'm insisting upon, which is all of these moving parts are going on. It's not, oh yeah, Thucydides, structural level, and now we're done. It's a much richer and more valuable set of tools that we can use in our own.
Weird. Hey.
So I want to ask a question that follows from what was just said, not this very last bit, but the bit before that, about whether there's a contradiction in Thucydides' emphasis on the problems of hubris and the arguments about national character. So if there's this idea that sort of being energetic and go-getter, those are all things that are risk-taking, and Sparta was stodgy and cautious. But what caution does is keep you from being hubristic. So how does that play out? It's been a long time since I've read any Thucydides. So how does that play out for Thucydides? For Thucydides?
Could you just say like one or two sentences more on what you mean by play out?
Well, so do you think there is a contradiction there? And does he see it? Does he see these as things that need to be balanced somehow? Or is there just a contradiction that he doesn't address?
So I think I don't know if it's a contradiction or if it's a paradox or a puzzle or a problem. Maybe it's a contradiction, because again, being limited in my ability to properly study Thucydides, the impression I get from him is that he was a proud Athenian. He does detail how the transformation of the so-called Delian League, I believe it was, the alliance that Athens led that was important in the Persian Wars, slowly transformed into the Athenian Empire, and that this turned the hearts and minds of the members of the empire sort of against and became very resentful toward Athens, and that Thucydides does not write in a voice that suggests that Athens should have renounced or reformed its empire. So that's absent. But he definitely preferred with the Spartan War a cautious war of limited aims that could be won. And he definitely thought that the invasion of Sicily was a horrible idea. And again, in Hunter Rawlings' description, you know, the greatest tragedy to befall Athens in its history. Okay, so that's the story he wants to tell, is the story of the catastrophe over Sicily. But the point you raise, you know, is a important one, and it is raised in words by many of the participants in these debates, starting with Pericles, but Alcibiades as well, and several other characters in which they argue you can't stop, right? So is the hubris then baked in, or if not hubris, is overexpansion baked in? Because a lot of these characters, they do say you cannot select that point at which you have reached, you know, peak imperial purpose. That wherever you are, and this is a classic problem, I guess, in IR, you know, you suddenly find new problems at the frontier that nudge you toward wanting to move forward. Thucydides does not give us an answer to that question. I do think it's a fair challenge, you know, if we could, as I always say to my students, what we want to do here is get up the panels, reanimate Thucydides, and say to him, what do you think about this? And I think if we challenge Thucydides in that way, you know, we would say, you seem to be clearly anxious about hubris, but at the other time, you seem to routinely invoke powerful arguments that it is difficult to pause the ongoing momentum of expansion. And so how do you kind of square that circle? That's a great question. It's a great problem. And I don't think he is definitive in his answer to that type of challenge.
I wanted to ask, Jack.
Well, thank you. So, Jonathan, at one point you said the Corinthians caused the war. I think you said.
There's such troublemakers.
But so
Troublemakers throughout.
yeah. So and you also mentioned that the Athenian alliance with Corcyra was a more, you know, defensive alliance. So I guess my question is, counterfactually, could Corinth have been deterred? That is, this takes us also back to Bob Jervis and talking about deterrence models, spiral models. Had Athens taken a stronger stand and had a more stronger commitment in the alliance with Corcyra, I mean, there's no perfect, we'll never know. But any sense of that, and why do you think Corinthians were the cause of the war?
So I may be getting ahead of my skis in blaming Corinth for the war, although I do think there are very accomplished scholars who come around this budget. Kagan blames the Athenians, and I think it's St. Croix who blames the Corinthians.
I think Kagan said that he criticized for failure to deter.
But I don't think it is an illustration of the failure of deterrence, because Athens' calculation was that if they went all in support of Corinth against Corcyra against the Corinthians, that would have been too provocative to Sparta, and that would have gotten their attention. And what they were trying to do is thread the needle of, again, they don't care about Corcyra at all. What all they care about is Corcyra has a third, you of all people would appreciate this more than anyone. They have the third largest navy in the region, right? And Athens says, we cannot have this navy fall into enemy hands. Our whole system is based on us having complete naval predominance. So we've got to do something to make sure that Corcyra is not defeated by Corinth. But they did explicitly say to themselves, but if we just go to war on Corcyra's behalf against Corinth, Sparta will probably enter that war, and that's not a war we want. So I don't know if your counterfactual conjecture that Corinth could have been deterred by a more aggressive Athenian response would have happened. It might have just been that would have been the the trigger for the larger war. And again, we're talking about levels of analysis. The debate is really any trigger will do, right? If there really is this underlying structural pressure that's causing a disruption in the international politics of this mini system, then if it wasn't Corinth and Coursera, then some other confrontation would have come up that would have led to these debates, that would have led to this war. But Corinth just comes across as, and I don't know the Greek history as well as I know Thucydides. I feel like I know Thucydides pretty well. The Greek history seems to suggest that the rivalry or the animosity, rivalry is not the right word, the animosity between Corinth and Athens is probably the most significant animosity that's taking place in the 2 decades before the Peloponnesian War. And so even though Athens and Sparta might view each other as predominant rivals, the people who are getting into the most constant disagreements are Athens and Corinth is just getting angrier and angrier and angrier, and that's why during the Spartan Council, they are so aggressive with Sparta in their insistence that enough is enough. Athens has become unbearable, and if you guys don't do something about this, then our friendship is over, and then they're gonna, find a way to deal with the Athenian problem by finding other friends to help them do it.
Kathy.
Hi, Kathy Jervis here. I just can't resist saying one of Bob's favorite things that was relevant to your last comment. How do we know any of this is true? Whoever writes the first draft controls history, and that's probably the root of why you're being able to give this talk today. And I thank you for your comment when I just walked in, and it made me. Anyway, I'm glad you're here, and I miss Bob too.
Well, thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to see you. And really, my thoughts are often with Bob, and the times that I did have to spend with him were just so very special. But to answer your question, for me, the great thing about whether Thucydides got things right is I don't care. I mean, what I gleaned from Thucydides is his analytical apparatus, right? I think I was talking, I don't think I said this during the talk. I think I said this in a meeting with graduate students. My apologies if I'm repeating myself. But 1914, 1919, the beginning and the end of World War I, which means that 100 years later, lots of people wrote lots of books about the beginning of World War I and the end of World War I. Let's take 10 great scholars, 10 honest scholars, 10 well-intentioned scholars, 1914. And every one of them had access to massive amounts of archives about what really happened. They would have written, they did write, 10 books, 10 different books, making 10 different arguments about the way things happened and what mattered. Right, so Thucydides was the only guy who wrote, a history of the Peloponnesian War. But we can imagine a counterfactual world in which we actually had 10 histories of the Peloponnesian War. It would have been Thucydides' version and 9 other figures' versions of the war, and every one of those books would have been different, and they would have disagreed not only on kind of causes and consequences, but they probably would have described events that happened differently. And Thucydides says very cheerfully that sometimes I just had to imagine what might have taken place here or there, and he just fills in the details. Now, I think he did that in good faith. I think he really tried hard to say, this is probably the kind of thing that would have happened in this situation, usually talking about what leaders said to others. But I don't view my job as someone who was inspired by Thucydides is to know how right Thucydides was, right? What I find compelling and applicable of Thucydides is his articulations of what I perceive to be the lessons for international politics that he would have us draw from his version of events. Now, it's, classicists do fight this out and say Thucydides got this wrong, Thucydides got that wrong. Back to Don Kagan. Kagan rejects the notion that Athenian power was really dramatically rising right before the Peloponnesian War. And that's for something for a classicist to work out. I have no idea, but I have literally no idea if Athenian power was rising before the Peloponnesian War. But I'm pretty confident that Thucydides thinks that Peloponnesian power was, that Athenian power was rising before the Peloponnesian War, and that was really important. So my job is not to investigate whether he got that right. My job is to think a lot about why he thinks that is an important mechanism for understanding world politics.
But to look at the converse, I think maybe you should take what Dick's argument a little more seriously. The prime example.
I always take Dick's.
That's good. I think we do to our peril. But you know, the prime example of hubris is the funeral oration. And no matter what a fanboy of Pericles he was, it's Pericles who's, you know, got this kind of imperial optimism that leads to the downfall. So you know, I think if you're going with the hubris argument, you got to ignore a little bit of his admiration.
Look, Pericles is a complex figure. I mean, I didn't know him well, but you know, he is an unabashed imperialist.
Yeah.
But his war strategy was astonishingly cautious and extremely unpopular even in Athens.
But in the end, it led to Alcibiades.
Well, you know, the counterfactual game you have to play there is, what if Pericles doesn't get sick and die, right? I mean, what if he's able to lead his polity throughout the course of the war? I find it hard to imagine, again, speaking about things beyond what I could possibly know. But the whole Sicilian campaign seems to be an illustration of everything Pericles warned against. And that Pericles was promising victory with this retreat, wait, naval raiding, and we just hang on and do that long enough and we win this thing. And the key is not to take on new responsibilities or embark upon new ambitious efforts. So, you know, yeah, Pericles is a warmongering imperialist, but at least in the war with Sparta, his strategy is extraordinarily prudent and cautious, and it got him into a lot of hot water with the Athenian public, who were actually enraged because much of the countryside was razed and burned, and they're coming to Pericles and saying, you know, and the young people especially are just dying to get out and fight. And Pericles is saying, you know, that is not how to win this war. You know, you may be angry and you may want to go out and confront them in the field, and that is a good way to lose this war. You know, just stick with me, you know, sit tight, and you know, and everything's on our side here. So it is, you know, it is tricky though. But again, Pericles, imperialist, warmonger, and you know, and what we would call today chauvinist. I mean, they're all heavily into the idea that Athens is special, kind of sitting on the hill and blah 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 and all that. But I cannot get from Pericles to Sicily.
Tendor.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up on Jack's question and ask something a little more practical about today's politics. And I think one reason why the Thucydidean lessons have attracted a lot of popular interest recently is because we kind of assume that the actors in the story map onto actors in today's world pretty well. But now I'm really confused after listening to your talk. Is the US Athens or is it Sparta? Is Athens US or China? Regime type, Athens is US. Rising power, Athens is China. And you know, and to what extent can a supposedly declining power draw lessons from a rising power, right? And how closely are the Chinese reading Thucydides?
So on your last question, I have no idea. I do not know how closely the Chinese have been.
And are the Corinthians the Taiwanese or the Ukrainians?
I think what I want to say most forcefully and passionately is that it does not map well. And that the world is worse off because we have invented this notion of a Thucydides trap, and that it has gained very widespread currency at elite levels around the world. Okay, but the plain spoken answer to your question, it does not map well. And your reasons for why it doesn't map well were good. There are lots and lots of other reasons and differences between these events, why it does not map well. So it's just a bad idea to get into that kind of conversation, not the one you raised, but the Thucydides about conversation, and to allow the kind of town hall to be built around that type of analytical thinking when it comes to the US and China, which is a gigantically consequential and, from an IR perspective, dangerously fraught situation that we need to think about in a very serious way, as opposed to, again, a bumper sticker sort of a way.
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dong Xiangrong from Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And 12 years ago, I'm visiting scholar here. I'm so happy to come back again. And from my perspective, or from China's perspective, that we think Thucydides' Tramp is very popular and very widely accepted in academic circle in the United States. And also, when President Xi Jinping he met American friends, he mentioned that Thucydides' Tramp is not an inevitability as long as the two countries exercise their vision and wisdom to handle their relationship responsibly. So I think maybe, as you mentioned, that we are not going to a Tramp, right? We can do something to keep our relationship stable and healthy. So my question is that, are there any misperception or misjudgment, misreading between these two countries that lead us such a difficult situation now? Thank you.
Thank you. I can't really speak to the misperception of the elites of the two sides, but I do want to, and this is, I think we're getting toward the end, so this is a good closing comment for me, if it happens to be my closing comment. Shift our thinking, which is, if there is a trap that we can derive from Thucydides, although again, I'm not a fan of the phrasing, it's less that the US and China will be the victims of a war brought about by systemic forces beyond their control, and more by this question of arrogance and hubris. And here, I think this is in Thucydides, but I think it's also very much in Bob Gilpin's work. And again, back to the book War and Change in World Politics, in which he argues, I mean, there's a formal analytical model in that book, but there's also an informal argument, which is that rising powers tend to be annoying. And that has nothing to do with China, that just has to do with rising powers in general. And that the established great powers tend to be resistant to the idea of allowing rising powers a seat at the table. And there's almost a kind of hubris fear paradox involved, in which when the established great power feels very strong and confident, that'll be the US in this story, they don't feel obligated to make accommodations to recognize the growth of the power in an emerging great power. But then after that power has grown to a certain extent, suddenly they're a little anxious, fearful that if they make accommodations to that growing power will perceive them to be weak and only ask for more. And so there is a kind of hubris fear paradox going on. But the levers are not about falling into a systemic level trap. The driving forces here are arrogance and hubris, the tendency for rising great powers to want to have sharp elbows and want more. And there's a initial reluctance on the part of established powers to accommodate that desire. And then again, as you get further on down the road, there is true anxiety. And this is why Gilpin argued in the book that there is a way out of this trap, and that is, Gilpin drawing on E.H. Carr, saying that peaceful change takes place when the established powers recognize the emergence of new great powers and make accommodations to those new great powers. But the problem is, again, when they can do it without feeling threatened, they don't. And later on, when they might be able to do it, they're a little bit too afraid to do it. And so you have almost these dueling arrogances that is, if there is a trap that countries are falling into, it again has to do with almost this enmeshment of hubris, arrogance, and fear that leads them down a path towards a perhaps unnecessary confrontation.
Well, this is indeed our end note, which was suitable. The Ken Waltz lectures were intended to have like big discussions of the big issues at a high level. And Jonathan, because of you and also because of our terrific audience, I think we've fulfilled the plan tonight. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.